In this lesson, we are going to be creating our course metadata endpoint. So we've already got our endpoint for the lesson itself, but in our app, we also have all of this other metadata that we need to access. We need to know the name of the course. We need to know the different chapters and the different lessons that we have in this course in order to render out this navigation on the left side here. So to do that, we'll create a course metadata endpoint. So we'll open up our folder here, and inside of the course folder, we'll add a new file. And since I always forget what exactly this method is called, we'll just copy and paste it in. Also, I'm too lazy to type, but that's okay. So for this endpoint, we're actually going to start it out the same way we did the other endpoint. And we need to grab all of these different types as well as the course data that we'll be using. Now, what we want to do is provide the course title as well as an outline of all of the different lessons. We don't want to provide the lessons with all of that extra data. We could just take this course JSON here and just return that. But of course, that's going to be way too much data, and we have no real need to send all of that over to the browser. To get started, we're first going to create the types that we'll need. Sometimes creating types first feels like a bit of a chore, but actually it's in a way like test-driven development. It forces you to think about your problem and to deconstruct it and break it down into smaller pieces. And once you've created the types that you need, you know that you've thought through the problem clearly, and then implementing it becomes much simpler. So we're first going to start with the types. Our very first type is the course meta. Now, this is the type that we're going to return from this method or from this endpoint. As we said before, we know that we want the title and then an outline, which we'll call chapters. And we're going to create a separate type for us without any of the extra things that come with the chapter. And we're going to call that an outline chapter. To create this outline chapter type, we're also going to create an outline base type, similar to what we did with the lesson and lesson with path. So this outline base type will have the title, the slug, and then the number. If we go into our course types here, we can see that our lesson and our chapter both have a title, a slug, and a number. So these are properties that are common to both the lesson and the chapter, and data that we want to be included in our metadata. This is so that we can have the title here as well as the number in here. And of course, we also need the slug so that we can construct that path correctly. So coming back over to our meta endpoint, we have this outline base, and to create the outline chapter and the outline lesson, we use this intersection operator again. So the outline chapter is the outline base, but with this lessons property on it. And the outline lesson is the same, but it also has this path on there. So now we can start to see the structure of the data that we are returning. We're going to have this chapters, which is an array. And all that that array contains is another array of lessons. So now it's time to actually implement this endpoint. And in order to do that, we are going to make use of the reduce function, which is one of my favorite things. And at the end here, we will return the object, the course meta object. So let's quickly go through what this code is doing. So we have our reduce up here, and we've got previous and next, and then this function here that computes that. We're going to start with an empty array. So the types here actually help us to read the code, because we can see that this reduce is going to return an array of outline chapters. So that means that this here must be itself an outline chapter, or an array of outline chapters, sorry. If you're not familiar with how reduce works, we first start with this initialized array, which in our case is an empty array. And for each item in this chapters array, we take the previous element and we get the next element. So in our case, we're going to start out with an empty array, which we will say is an outline chapter array. And we'll grab that first chapter. Then we compute all the different lessons from that, and then construct ourselves this outline chapter object. And once we have this outline chapter, we can then stick it onto the end of the array and keep going. Then when we get the next item, we have this array, which now has one chapter in it. And then as we go through the array, we keep adding these chapters to it. So how are we computing these lessons here? Well, here we're just mapping the lessons. And what we're doing is really mapping from a lesson with path type to an outline lesson type. So here is where we're really getting rid of all of the data that we don't need. This implementation could have also been done with two maps. If you are using something like Lodash or another utility library, they also have pick methods, and we could be using something like that. There are a lot of different ways to implement something like this, but this is how I have implemented it here. So now let's go over to Hopscotch to see if we're actually returning the data that we think we are, because that's always the important part. So I'm going to duplicate this request. And then I will move it out of that folder, and we'll edit the name. And then we need to edit the URL that we hit. And now we will run this. So the JSON that we get back is the title of the course, along with the chapters, which is an array. We get the title and the slug and the number for the chapter, as well as all of the lessons. But the lessons only contain the title, slug, number, and path. And as we scroll down, we can see that the structure of this data is, in fact, what we were hoping for. Now, in this particular case, the data is actually not a huge amount. So the difference between what this endpoint returns and what our course data file here is not actually that different. But you can imagine that if our text in the lesson is substantial, that this could actually mean a huge amount of data. Are you going to send over all 50,000, 100,000 words of content in a written course, or are you going to just return the metadata? That can be a pretty significant difference. So if we come over to our test results, we see that it actually failed. And that's because the title is incorrect. So let's update that. The title is not the title of the first lesson anymore, but in this case, the title of the course. So make sure to save that. And now our test runs successfully. In our meta endpoint here, we actually don't need these two types here. As you can tell from the syntax highlighting, they're grayed out. So why don't we just get rid of those before moving on? So now we have two endpoints. We've got the lesson endpoint and the course metadata endpoint. And these should be good enough for us to now transition into putting all of our data into a database and fetching it through our API. In the next lesson, we will look at setting up Prisma with our project so that we can then use a database from Supabase, put all of this course data in there, and use the database instead of a local JSON file.